Okay, thank you all for attending. We're excited that there's so much interest in this meeting today. I'm Dan Gullett, Principal Planner for the City of Santa Barbara. Joining us today is Melissa Hetrick. She is the city's project manager for this effort. Also joining us is Nick Garrity. He's the Southern California Environmental Hydrology and Design Director for Environmental Science Associates. They're the city's primary consultant on this project. And Timmy Bolton. He's from City Planning Running Technology for this meeting today. There are other city staff in attendance as well, including Renee Brooks, City Planner. Melissa has a presentation that goes about a half an hour. And after that, we're going to have a question and answer period. We have about 100 people signed up, so there may not be time to get through everyone's questions. If we don't have time, we're available offline as well. So with that, I'll hand it off to Melissa.
Thanks, Dan. As Dan mentioned, I'm Melissa Hetrick with the city's planning department, and I'm the project manager on the draft sea level rise adaptation plan. And I just wanted to welcome you to the webinar. We really appreciate you attending and wanting to find out more about our plan. Next slide. So as Dan mentioned, I'm going to start with a 30-minute presentation on the draft sea level rise adaptation plan. I'm going to go through some background, how the city is vulnerable to sea level rise, and then how we're planning to address increased risks with sea level rise. We'll then have time for people to ask questions. And if we don't get to your questions, or if you have much more that you wanted to discuss, we are available. I am available for questions. I'll give you my contact information at the end of the slides, and feel free to contact me. We are at the end of a 60-day public comment period on the draft sea level rise plan, and we are looking for comments by September 30th. And we're hoping that people send those comments via email. We really are looking for written comments. It makes it a lot easier for us to document those and send them on to our consultants and then also decision makers. So next slide. So just a little background, next slide. So to date, offshore of Santa Barbara, sea levels have not risen very much, but in upcoming years, it's expected that sea level rise will accelerate significantly. And the Santa Barbara shoreline has always been at risk for erosion and flooding during extreme storm events. And on the right, you'll see three pictures from the March 1983 El Nino storm that occurred here. The top picture is of the Santa Barbara Yacht Club in the harbor, which was destroyed and flooded during that event. The bottom right photo is the end of Stearns Wharf, which buckled during that event. And then the left photo is just showing debris and flooding across Cabrillo Boulevard, which fronts our waterfront. So with sea levels rising, it's just expected that these more extreme erosion and flooding events will happen more frequently and to a greater degree moving forward. And so because of that, the city's general plan and coastal plan direct preparation of a comprehensive sea level rise plan for the city. And in addition, sea level rise analysis is now required for all coastal development permitting. In addition, it's pretty much required for any permitting or grant opportunities at the state level. Next slide. So the city has been working on sea level rise since 2011, and I'm not going to go through each of these plans and efforts, but I would like to highlight a few. One of the first vulnerability assessments that was done for the city was the 2012's Griggs and Russell Vulnerability Assessment. And that really was a great report that was incorporated into our general plan, climate action plan, and several plans moving forward. In 2015, Santa Barbara County undertook additional hazard modeling through its coastal resiliency project, and that too fed into many other work efforts that we've done. And then, as many of you may know, in 2018, USGS released Cosmos 3.0, which models hazards according to sea level rise offshore of California, and that really hasn't been the basis for much of our work in this current adaptation plan. The other plan I'd like to highlight is the Coastal Land Use Plan. In 2019, the city certified a comprehensively updated coastal land use plan. And as part of that effort, we included policies that address hazards associated with sea level rise for coastal development permitting, while we're developing a more comprehensive sea level rise plan. So I get asked a lot whether or not we have existing development review standards that factor in sea level rise, and we do. Those are part of the 2019 Coastal Land Use Plan. They are just interim until we finalize our final sea level rise adaptation plan. Next slide. So luckily, I am not alone in planning for sea level rise. We have an entire interdepartmental team at the city working on this, and that includes members from every major department, public works, parks, waterfront. We also have a team of consultants led by environmental science associates. We created a sea level rise adaptation plan subcommittee, which consists of members of our council, planning commission, parks and rec commission, harbor commission, and water commission to provide input on the plan. And then we've been consulting closely with the Coastal Commission, Ocean Conservancy, Coastal Conservancy, which partially funded this plan, in addition to our regional partners such as Beacon, the county, and other agencies. In addition, we have an extensive website we'd love you to visit. It's www.santabarbaraca.gov/SLR. Next slide. So we launched the more comprehensive sea level rise adaptation plan effort in 2018. The current plan covers all areas of the city except for the airport area, which was studied in 2015 as part of a multi-jurisdictional effort to look at the entire Goleta Slough area. So at the end of 2018, we released a updated vulnerability assessment that looked at increased risks of erosion and flooding from sea level rise out to 2100. And really what this did is tell us what would happen if no action is taken. On August 11th, we released a public review draft sea level rise adaptation plan that provides the city's options for mitigating the risks identified in the vulnerability assessment. So the adaptation plan includes the vulnerability assessment. It provides a framework for future planning and phases. It includes guiding principles for prioritization of actions. It analyzes a number of adaptation options, allowing the city flexibility to employ different adaptation options through time, and it considers economic and fiscal impacts. I do just like to note that the adaptation plan really is a first order plan. It looked at the entire city. We were not able to look at every pipe the city owns or answer every question. In addition, the sea level rise adaptation plan does not commit the city to any given action right now. You can really think of it more as a to-do list. So it basically lists out actions the city could take and studies the city could undertake, and then gives us an idea of when certain decisions need to be made by. And so moving forward, after council reviews the adaptation plan and we move into implementation, it's at that time that any given recommended adaptation action in the plan would be further developed and then go through the normal city and permitting process. Next slide. So how is the city vulnerable to sea level rise? So there are a number of factors that affect the rate of sea level rise offshore of Santa Barbara. And these include things such as how the Antarctic ice sheet is melting, vertical land motion, differing ocean circulation patterns, and thermal expansion of the Pacific Ocean from global warming. And all these different factors mean that sea levels are not rising the same amount across the globe. And in fact, if you look at sea level rise amounts throughout the world, you'll see that sea levels have risen a lot more on the east coast of the United States. And in Santa Barbara, they really have only risen a small amount in comparison. But also what is happening is as information emerges about each one of these factors, it leads to new projections of how sea level rise might change in the future. So next slide. So what the state of California is doing is that approximately every 5 years, they are convening a technical working group and wading through all the different projections for offshore of California and recommending to each city and county how much sea level rise we should be planning for. And they've encompassed that in their document called the 2018 State of California Sea Level Rise Guidance. And this graph shows some of the projections contained in that guidance. And so according to that guidance, the state wants us to plan for the middle line, the middle blue line, which is 0.8 feet of sea level rise by 2030, 2.5 feet by 2060, and 6.6 feet by 2100. So this is a risk adverse and conservative projection. It has something like a 1 in 200 chance of being met or exceeded. In addition to this projection, there are much more likely scenarios, such as shown by the orange line, and then there are much more extreme scenarios shown by the red line. So these are all the projections shown on this screen are all high emissions projections. If you take a look at if the world were to decrease emissions over time, you would see projections that show sea levels rising much more gradually and then leveling off at some point. Just something to note about these projections, you'll note that in the next 10 years or so, the projections are much closer together. Meaning that there's a lot less uncertainty in the next 10 years. But as you move out in time toward 2100, there's a much bigger range of how things could go. Another thing to note is if you really look at all these projections and go beyond 2100, you'll see that each of them eventually reaches 6.6 feet of sea level rise. It's just that we either reach it sooner or later depending on the projection. So knowing that sea level rise projections are going to be changing over time, the city's approach to adaptation planning is to closely track sea level rise and changing shoreline conditions, and then to plan around amounts of sea level rise reached rather than exact years when it might occur, if that makes sense. Next slide. So you'll see in the document these terms, near term, midterm, and long term. And when we use those, we mean certain amounts of sea level rise. So near term is between 0 and 0.8 feet of sea level rise, which is generally the next 10 years. And then mid and long term spans from 0.8 feet of sea level rise to 6.6 feet of sea level rise. Next slide. So for those of you not familiar with Santa Barbara, this is our shoreline. The city shoreline in general is very urbanized, but despite that urbanization, the majority of the city's land that it directly touches water is predominantly the harbor, parks, or recreation uses or open spaces. So approximately 70% of the Santa Barbara shoreline is publicly owned and managed. The west side of the city is dominated by beaches that are backed by coastal bluffs. And on top of the bluffs, there's predominantly single-family residential development, and in addition, two major parks, Douglas Family Preserve and Shoreline Park. On the east side of the city, we have the low-lying waterfront area that has extensive beach areas and public recreation areas. We have the harbor and Stearns Wharf. And then the lower downtown area extends all the way down to Cabrillo Boulevard, which fronts the waterfront. We have Highway 101 and the railroad running through this area. And just south of Highway 101 is located our desalination plant and the Estero Water Resources Center, which is our wastewater treatment plant. In addition, in this low-lying area, there are several major creeks that flow through this area out to the ocean, including Mission Creek, Laguna Creek, and Sycamore Creek. Next slide. So the vulnerability assessment looked at a number of hazards. It looked at tidal inundation, which is flooding from the regular high tide. It looked at year-to-year bluff erosion and shoreline erosion, And then it looked at where waves would break and where flooding would occur during the 100-year coastal storm. And then it also looked at low-lying areas of the city that could flood more, that aren't directly connected to the ocean, but which could flood more frequently moving forward due to raising groundwater levels from sea level rise. Next slide. So these are the hazard maps that came out of the vulnerability assessment, and just two notes about the maps. One is that they show what would happen if no action is taken. Additionally, these maps do not show all the erosion and flood hazards in the city. They only show the erosion and flood hazards that would be exacerbated by sea level rise. So this is the west side of the city, the coastal bluff area of the city. And the area in orange and yellow shows risk of bluff failure or erosion. And this is 0.8 feet of sea level rise. And if you look at our existing condition map, it's very similar to this map. We have a risk now of bluff failure along our bluffs. Next slide. So by 2.5 feet of sea level rise, we see bluff erosion rates increasing approximately 40% above historic rates. We see bluff erosion reaching Shoreline Drive in the vicinity of Ledbetter Beach. At 2.5 feet of sea level rise, it's also projected that 80% of the beaches that are backed by bluffs will be lost. And the reason for that high loss of beaches backed by bluffs is that essentially as sea levels rise, sea level rise will occur faster than bluffs can erode back and essentially will drown out the beaches. Next slide. So by 6.6 feet of sea level rise, we see erosion rates approximately 140% higher than historic rates. We see erosion reaching shoreline drives in multiple locations and Cliff Drive. And we see private parcels and Shoreline Park in particular affected. Next slide. So this is the east side of the city, the low-lying waterfront, and you'll notice as we go through that the beach loss with sea level rise on this side of the city is a lot less. And the reason for that is the orientation of the coast in this area, the fact that we have a low-lying area behind the beaches here. But in addition, probably the single biggest factor for beach retention in this area is the presence of our harbor breakwater. So the harbor breakwater essentially acts as a groin, which allows sand to build up behind it and form Ledbetter Beach to its west. In addition, sand gets trapped in the harbor and along West Beach. And then the Army Corps and the city dredge those areas and then put the sand on East Beach so that it can both protect that beach and then also move down coast. So again, this is 0.8 feet of sea level rise. It's pretty close to the hazards that we see now. The light aqua color is tidal inundation or flooding during regular high tides. And the dark blue colors are where storm waves would occur and flooding would occur during coastal storm events. So we have a risk of flooding during coastal storm events in our harbor and up to Cabrillo Boulevard now. Next slide. So at 2.5 feet of sea level rise, you'll see that predominantly the impacts from sea level rise are still predominantly south of Cabrillo Boulevard still. That said, many of our public assets in that area will be affected. The harbor parking lots, several of our sewer mains under the beach will be flooded out with tidal inundation, and erosion will impact several of our parking lots and beaches. Next slide. So this is 6.6 feet of sea level rise, and at this point you see storm flooding extending well north of Highway 101. So again, the darker blue colors are flooding during storm events, and then the aqua color is flooding during regular high tides or tidal inundation. So if you look at this blue area, you might, if you're from Santa Barbara, you might recognize this from old pictures of what was called the Estero. So essentially this blue area used to be a big wetland called the Estero. And after the 1929 earthquake, it was filled to create this lower downtown area. And it remains a portion of the city which is low-lying and which currently floods during high rainfall events. So if you look at our FEMA flood maps, this area already is in our flood zone and floods during high rainfall events. So the difference with 6.6 feet of sea level rise is that north of Highway 101, it's expected that flooding would be similar depths to what occurs now, but the flooding would be much more frequent, as it would be flooding not just during high rainfall events, but also during coastal storm or high wave events. And then south of Highway 101, we see tidal inundation or regular high tides reaching up to Highway 101 in multiple locations, affecting the railroad, our Estero Water Resource Center, and most of the harbor. Next slide. So I do just like to touch on the wastewater system because I get asked about that a lot, and in particular, the Estero Water Resource Center or wastewater treatment plant. So that facility, Estero, is actually happens to be located on a piece of land that is slightly above adjacent areas. And so while the plant itself will be hard to access and will have potential impacts by 6.6 feet of sea level rise, the issue in the next 30 years or so is not so much the plant itself, but rather the collection system, this sewer collection system that feeds into the plant. Right now, most of the city's sewage flows downhill into major sewer lines that are located under the beach, and then those feed into the plant. And with sea levels rising, those major sewer lines could be flooded and affect operations at the plant. So you'll see when we move into adaptation, there are near-term measures that recommend moving some of those lines. Next slide. So moving into how the city is planning to adapt to sea level rise. So the plan recommends a phased approach to planning for sea level rise, and it's based upon monitoring of shoreline conditions and then taking action when certain triggers or thresholds are reached. And those triggers or thresholds are not based on when a hazard would occur, but are actually backed away from the actual hazard to give us time for planning too. So the plan recommends very specific near-term actions that the city could take in the next 10 years to get ready for sea level rise. And then it proposes a structure for decision-making in the mid and long term. After the adaptation plan is approved, it's recommended that the city develop a 5-year implementation plan. And essentially what that would do is take the list of near-term actions and further scope them out as far as costs, funding, options, timelines, and required resources, and then further prioritize these actions. So essentially getting the actions ready to be put into our capital improvement program and also our other city programs. One of the first actions that's recommended is the development of a shoreline monitoring program with our regional partners. And the results of that shoreline monitoring program would then lead to the regular update of the 5-year implementation plan. And then it's also recommended that the overall long-term adaptation plan be reevaluated every 10 years at least, or as significant new information arises. Next slide. So if you look at the cumulative costs of the city taking no action through to 6.6 feet of sea level rise, the cost is very high to both private and public landowners, in addition to other city operations. It's something like $4 billion. However, the cost of protecting everything is equally as expensive. And so moving forward, it's going to be very important for the city to closely consider which actions it takes to mitigate the risks of sea level rise. And so recognizing that our sea level rise subcommittee developed what we're calling guiding principles for adaptation. And essentially what they do is assist in prioritization and planning for sea level rise. So the highest priorities listed in these guiding principles are protection of human life, health, and safety, and protection of critical facilities, public transportation systems, and public services for basic city functions. But the guiding principles go beyond that. They also encourage minimization of impacts to coastal access, coastal resources, existing development, and the economy. And they also encourage actions that broadly benefit the community and provide equitable sharing of costs and benefits between different sectors of the community. Next slide. So the adaptation plan looked at a number of options, and they generally fall into three major categories. One, the first type is protection options, and those protect development in place through measures such as seawalls, groins, tide gates, and beach nourishment. There's accommodation measures, which accommodate development in place through measures such as elevation or modification of structures. And then there's retreat options, such as relocation or removal of development, or development limitations, such as hazard buffers for new development. Next slide. So I did just want to talk specifically about revetments and seawalls because they come up a lot. The top picture is a rock revetment and the bottom picture is a seawall. And both structures are designed to prevent erosion and flooding for the structures that are behind them. So over time with sea level rise, these structures can be costly to maintain, as significant repair over time often needs to occur. The other issue with these structures is that they can cause the loss of beach area, particularly in front of the structures and on either side. And the reason for that is both the area that they take up on the beach themselves, the fact that they keep the shoreline's edge in one position and so that it can't erode back. But in addition, when waves hit these structures, instead of the wave dissipating out, the wave is often reflected back and causes erosion in front of the structure. So while these structures can be very useful at protecting development in place and have their place for some uses, they do come at a cost that needs to be considered. And because of that, the city of Santa Barbara has had a long history of only allowing revetments and seawalls for things like the harbor or protection of major public roads. But moving forward, there will be increased pressure to use revetments and seawalls for other uses. Next slide. So now I'm just going to go through some of the recommendations as far as adaptation options in the different areas of the city. So for the coastal bluffs areas, the plan did take a look at the potential for using beach nourishment and sand retention structures such as groins to retain sand on these beaches that are backed by bluffs. And what the plan found was that these options really would not be very effective along the bluffs. And a lot of that has to do with the high rate of sand transport along the bluffs. So essentially, as soon as you would put sand on these beaches, it would wash away or be drowned out. The plan does provide as options for protecting development the use of rock revetments and slope protection. And in addition, relocation is always an option. Next. So in the near term, the recommended actions are to continue to require bluff setbacks that factor in sea level rise. And while we still have use of the beach under the bluffs, to continue to limit revetments, prioritizing their use for things like protecting major public roads or other coastal dependent uses. And that we also plan to relocate and remove assets in Shoreline Park and Douglas Family Preserve. So in the mid and long term, around 1.5 or 2 feet of sea level rise, the city will need to consider whether to allow the use of larger scale revetments or slope stabilization to protect shoreline drive in place, or whether to consider alternate circulation routes or relocation of infrastructure. Next slide. So again, this is what we're calling our low-lying and waterfront area. And again, I think I mentioned that the harbor breakwater provides a lot of protection for us moving forward. And the key issue in this area is tidal inundation and flooding. So next slide. So some of the recommended near-term actions in this area are to consider and study additional beach nourishment, seasonal beach berms, and possibly the formation of permanent dunes on some of our waterfront beaches and possibly also Arroyo Burro Beach. That we redesign and possibly relocate an existing tide gate that's located on Laguna Creek, which currently prevents flooding up into the lower area of downtown. It essentially needs to be repaired and raised to address sea level rise. That we relocate or otherwise flood-proof the sewer mains and other utilities that are located under the beach. And next slide. That we also consider revisions to our floodplain regulations for south of Highway 101 to require new development and substantial redevelopment to be flood-proof to a higher elevation than required now. Additional near-term actions that are recommended are continuing our existing development requirements south of Cabrillo Boulevard that factor in erosion and flooding from sea level rise into their design. And in addition, it's recommended that we initiate system-specific studies of mid and long-term options for our wastewater, stormwater, and water systems. Next slide. So in the mid and long term, around 1.5 to 2 feet of sea level rise, the city will need to consider whether to employ large-scale flood protection measures along its waterfront. And in order to mitigate the risks of the extensive flooding that's shown on the map for 6.6 feet of sea level rise, really would require multiple large-scale flood protection measures employed together. So that would have to include a continuous seawall or levee along the waterfront spanning from Ledbetter Beach to the Clark Estate. And this could either be raising Cabrillo Boulevard, essentially making it a levee, or a seawall south of Cabrillo Boulevard. Those seawalls or levees would have to tie into levees or floodwalls along our lower portions of our major creeks, so Mission Creek, Laguna Creek, and Sycamore Creek. Due to groundwater levels rising in this area, we would also have to consider the use of groundwater dewatering wells. And because stormwater would essentially be coming down and hitting floodwalls and seawalls, we would have to pump stormwater over those walls. And of course, relocation and floodproofing of facilities is always an option. So there are a lot of unknowns about these larger scale flood protection measures, a lot of feasibility unknowns, a lot of studies that need to be done of interaction with river flows and changes in rainfall patterns from climate change. In addition, there's a lot of other questions such as legal questions and how this would all get funded, et cetera. So you'll see that in our near-term actions, there's a number of studies that are recommended that the city conduct in the near term in order to make an informed decision about these mid and long-term options. Next slide. So at the harbor, it's recommended that in the near term, the city raise the existing breakwater and groins and the walkway around the harbor, so essentially raising the rim of the bathtub of the harbor. It's recommended that as we renovate our marinas and pier, that we raise the piles of those facilities. There's some existing seawalls in the harbor commercial area, and it's recommended that we consider raising and extending those. And in addition, it's recommended that we further flood-proof buildings in the harbor. Next slide. So again, in the mid and long term, the city will need to consider whether to raise the grades of the harbor commercial area or whether to relocate and remove some facilities at the harbor. In addition, the city will need to decide whether to raise, redesign, or remove Stearns Wharf. The issue with Stearns Wharf is not so much the threat of regular high tides reaching its deck. The issue is really more about storm damage. So the wharf itself now is at risk during major storm events. And so over time, as sea levels rise, it just becomes more likely that a storm event will damage the wharf. So at some point, the city is going to need to decide when to start evacuating the wharf during storm events, and then whether to redesign, raise the wharf, or remove it. Next slide. So the adaptation plan also recommends a number of citywide recommendations. Those include amending city policies and procedures and adjusting staffing to implement the plan, amending our city documents such as our local coastal program, our hazard mitigation plan, which describes our approach for emergency planning, and our municipal code and our capital improvement program. It also recommends that we consider increased use of hazard disclosures and risk indemnifications moving forward, that we coordinate closely with regional, state, and federal agencies, that we do additional public engagement, particularly to landowners that might be affected, and that we retain our sea level rise subcommittee and interdepartmental teams to work on this program, and that we aggressively pursue funding opportunities and follow emerging information on sea level rise. Next slide. So this is our schedule. As I mentioned, we're nearing the end of our 60-day public comment period, and we are hoping to get comments by September 30th, and you can send any comments to me at slrplan@santabarbaraca.gov. We'll then make revisions to the plan and reconvene our subcommittee, and they will make a recommendation on the plan. And then we're hoping that council will consider the final plan at the end of the year. So I did just want to give a plug for our webpage, www.santabarbaraca.gov/SLR. On there, you can find our documents. You can sign up for notifications moving forward. In addition, on there, you'll find interactive hazard maps. So you can basically type in any address at the city, in the city, and see what kind of hazards will exist at that address over time. And again, I encourage anyone who has questions after this webinar to contact me, and I'd be happy to discuss the plan with you. Next slide. So now I'm going to hand it back to Dan to moderate questions, and I thank you for listening.
Great job, Melissa. Thank you very much. So the way questions will work is Timmy Bolton will identify those who want to speak. So there's this icon, this raised hand. So you click on that and then your name will come up and Timmy will call on you for that. The other option is the written question. So that just goes in the chat box. So I'll monitor that. Just a note, I may group questions or paraphrase questions. This is our first time doing this, so I'll do my best. And this was scheduled to go till 4:30. If there's interest, we can go a bit further than that. So we'll just see how it goes. And I'm seeing a couple of questions already. So someone's interested in the area around the airport. Melissa or Nick, could you speak to how the airport's being looked at?
Sure. So the airport was studied in 2015 as part of a multi-jurisdictional plan looking at the Goleta Slough area. I believe the plan's called the Goleta Slough Management Plan and Sea Level Rise Analysis. And it was really more of a vulnerability assessment at this point, but the airport is now looking to plan for more adaptation, including raising its runways over time. At least in the near term, those are the main options for the airport. But that is definitely, the airport is an area of concern for the city that we are closely watching.
And there was a question where the location of that report is. Is that on the airport's website or some other City of Goleta?
If you go to the Goleta Slough Management Committee, that report is on there. You know what I'll do? That's actually a good point. I'll put a link to that report on our webpage so that you can access it. Also, feel free to email me at slrplan@santabarbaraca.gov. and I can send you the link as well.
Okay, and there's a question on regional coordination. It's how are you coordinating with neighboring cities like Carpenteria?
Yes, so we are regularly meeting with those agencies to coordinate on sea level rise analysis. And we are also coordinating through Santa Barbara County Association of Governments and newly formed climate collaborative that the Santa Barbara County has created. In addition, we're working closely with Beacon, which is a joint powers authority of cities and counties in Ventura and Santa Barbara County. And in particular, we're currently looking at joint shoreline monitoring with them and are applying for grants to establish a regional shoreline monitoring program. But in general, I would say there is a need for more formal collaborative entities at both the state and regional level to address sea level rise. And that is definitely a to-do for all of us moving forward to more formally establish such an entity.
And there's a related question to that. How will actions around Santa Barbara Harbor potentially impact Carpenteria?
So the harbor now, now traps sand, and we dredge that newly trapped sand and put it on East Beach, and then it flows down to Carpenteria. And so so it's that since the harbor breakwater was built, that has been the case. So moving forward, we're actually looking at increased amounts of dredging and increased beach nourishment down coast. But that is a really good comment, because I think moving forward, one of the things that we've talked about at Beacon is having kind of like a set of guiding principles for each jurisdiction moving forward that promote not just coordination together, but also projects that don't negatively impact each other with regard to sand supply and erosion.
Okay, and then we have a question asking about the number of residential units, homes that would be affected in different areas of the city.
You know, I have to look up the number of residential units. I do know that by 6.6 feet of sea level rise, approximately, I think it's 1,200 parcels are affected. That's both private and public, but the majority of those are private because public parcels tend to be these like huge parcels that extend across the whole shoreline. But I'd have to look up the, in particular, residential numbers. Nick, I'm not sure, do you have those numbers on hand or?
No, sorry, I don't, but I believe they are included in the vulnerability assessment.
Yeah, the vulnerability assessment is Appendix A of the Adaptation Plan, and it does break down the counts by residential unit numbers, commercial, industrial, public versus private, that kind of thing.
Okay, and then there's a question probably best suited for Nick. It's asking for a comment on the use of floating structures to accommodate changing sea conditions, which could potentially replace Stearns Wharf or other structures.
Good question. Yeah, floating structures, of course, are used within the harbor currently for docks and are typically used in that type of sheltered harbor environment and can be, very effective. In an unsheltered open coast environment, floating structures really aren't that effective due to the wave exposure, and because floating structures would be without the protection of, say, the breakwater at the harbor would get destroyed by waves during large wave events. So it's not an adaptation measure that was looked at for the open exposed coast of the city, but it was considered for within the harbor on how the existing floating docks could be modified and adapted for higher sea level rise by, for example, raising the guide piles that the docks float on.
Okay, and then there's a question about building reefs in the near shore to dissipate wave energy and protect beach sand from wave erosion.
Nick, why don't you start with that one, and maybe I'll follow up with some comments.
Sure. Offshore reefs are considered in the adaptation plan as a potential adaptation strategy that would provide multiple benefits in both serving as in a sense, submerged breakwater that would reduce wave action behind the offshore reef and allow for sand to accumulate on the beach behind that submerged offshore reef or structure. And there's also thought that these types of structures could provide other benefits for both habitat, which has been done within California, and potentially for surfing, though that is more experimental and kind of being developed currently and tested in some locations considered in California, I think tested outside of California currently. So it is a measure that is considered within the adaptation plan.
So I would just add to that that it's definitely one of the options that we're considering. In the low-lying waterfront area, our biggest issue moving forward toward the long term really is that big tidal inundation area that we're facing and the large area of flooding during storms that could affect up to 1,200 parcels. And so with artificial reefs, they don't prevent that type of storm flooding and tidal inundation. They do help with beach erosion, although you'd have to, with sea level rise, continue to raise them in order for them to remain below the water surface, but also be effective. So the maintenance costs could be a lot. So it's not so much that we're not considering those options, it's just that I would say they're not on the highest priority list right now, simply because they don't address our biggest need.
Okay, and then another question about adaptation options. So are living shorelines being discussed instead of yearly berming of sand?
Yes, that is an option that is being considered on several waterfront beaches, whether we have the right amount of space and sediment movement characteristics to have more permanent dune systems. That needs to be looked into further. It would potentially affect uses on those beaches because they do take up some area. But that is one of the things that we'll be looking at in the future.
Okay, and thank you to Rachel Couch. She's saying Goleta Slough area sea level rise vulnerability assessment and management plan can be found at www.goletaslough.org. Select the 2015 management plan update.
Thank you, Rachel.
Let's see. The next is how about special building permits for elevating homes?
That's a really good comment. That could be something that could be considered. The main thing we've been looking at initially is changing our floodplain regulations for new development so that as new developments put in over time, we start raising the buildings. But I think that's a really good comment about potentially utilizing incentives such as quicker building permits if people want to raise their structures. That's a really good comment.
Okay, and then is there a consideration of a lowland or high risk property buyout program?
So that is discussed in the plan. That's something that would need to be fleshed out a lot. Right now, the city, with its current situation especially, does not have the funds to buy out a lot of parcels. And so right now there are FEMA programs that do fund out buyout programs. They usually only do that when a parcel has been experienced flooding multiple times. So basically addressing existing hazards. But moving forward, it's widely thought that FEMA is going to have to change its program to better address future hazards. Similarly, there's a hazard mitigation program now which will fund buyout programs, but again, it's federally funded and it focuses on existing flood risks, not so much future flood risks. And so that's something the city will be tracking closely. Right now, that would not be an option for a number of parcels just because of the structure of funding, but that's something that we have talked about, talking closely with our federal and state partners about potential for funding those type of options.
Okay, and then what options are being considered for the wastewater and water filtration plants?
So as I mentioned in the presentation, the issue with the Estero Water Resource Center is a long-term one. And in fact, the plan itself would be surrounded by tidal inundation, but actually would not be inundated itself. That said, at that point, it's not very useful if you can't access your plant. But 6.6 feet of sea level rise is a fair way off. And one of the studies that needs to be done in the near term are options for that plant. It doesn't have to be potentially a wholesale removal or anything like that. We still would be serving need to serve development down in that area. And so we'd want to retain at least portions of the plant. And portions of the plant are able to be flood proofed. It's not an all or nothing situation. And so there's a number of options the city could consider about redesigning the system and making it more flood proof. So that really needs to be a system specific study because it really depends not on just like the hydraulics of the system, but also the conditions of the areas where the sewer system is serving. So what's going on in the low-lying areas that we are serving.
Okay, let's see. What input and direction have federal and state regulatory agencies offered for protection of critical highway and rail corridors?
I'm not aware of any very particular guidance. I know that Caltrans and SBCAG are doing transportation specific adaptation plans to look at options for many of our rail and big transportation corridors. Nick, do you know?
No, sorry.
Okay, yeah. So I know that things are currently in process as far as Caltrans and SBCAG developing adaptation plans for its bigger highways and even our smaller highways, but I have not seen any final guidance or anything like that yet.
Okay, and there's an interest in the triggers that we have and how specific they are, and an offer from USCC grant to help us think about those.
I will take your offer. So the the thresholds identified in the plan now are very preliminary. They are just kind of a first brush of kind of like what's a general sea level rise amount or time frame that we need to make decisions by. Our next step as part of developing our shoreline monitoring program is to further define thresholds associated with that monitoring program. So what will happen when we get within 10 feet of a structure with erosion, or what will happen when we start seeing groundwater levels above a certain amount. So that really does need to be fleshed out more. So I appreciate the offer for help.
And then a question of whether there's been consideration on relocating critical infrastructure like the wastewater treatment plant inland or higher ground.
Yes, that is an option for the wastewater treatment plant. Again, that's only very conceptually being considered. We really need a system-specific study to look at long-term options for the wastewater system. And that is one of the near-term measures that we will want to start initiating soon.
And amazingly, 429, the last question is, will the recorded webinar be available on the Sea Level Rise website?
It will, and in addition, there is already an existing presentation video on our website, but we can also add this one. Did we
Great.
have
Well,
anybody that raised their hand?
Right now, I don't see anyone who has. I'd encourage anyone who has a desire to say anything verbal to please raise their hand. The instructions on the screen, it's a little counterintuitive, but if the hand is raised and it's red, then that means you have your hand raised.
and we did get a web link for the Caltrans vulnerability assessment, so
Oh,
we've been
good.
put on the Sea Level Rise website.
And I do
Perfect.
see Terry Persons has their hand raised, so I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. It looks like your audio is live, Terry, so if you have a question.
Okay, this is Terry Persons with the Planning Division at Caltrans District 5. So I just sent you the link to our vulnerability assessment. So
Right.
each district has completed a vulnerability assessment, and then our district, and it's going to be starting in January, will be doing an adaptation strategies plan. And so headquarters has a consultant that's working with all the districts. I think it's WSP is the lead consultant on that effort. So there's more things that are going on. There's a number of resources, and other districts are much further ahead than us because we had to go last with our vulnerability assessment because the data wasn't available yet. But once they got the data that they needed, then they did our vulnerability assessment for District 5. So anyway, so I just wanted to send you that link so other people could see those resources. And if you go to the climate change website for Caltrans, there's additional information and resources there as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for letting us know that.
Great. We do have another question. Is there any priority for low income or disadvantaged neighborhood needs?
So one of the measures, guiding principles, does relate to that. We are actually, one of the major comments on the plan that we thought was really good, and we are already starting to make revisions, is to incorporate socioeconomic data into our impacts analysis, and that as we start moving forward looking at potential adaptation options, that we look at potential impacts and benefits to disadvantaged and severely disadvantaged and other community groups. And so it is something that could be highlighted more. I think it's a good comment to highlight it more in our guiding principles and moving forward. But we are looking at that and considering it moving forward.
Okay, and there's another question. It's kind of a long one. I'll read through it. Do you believe the fact that you have no input from state and federal agencies to protect or retreat rail and highway infrastructures indicates that those agencies see the data does not presently indicate these measures are necessary?
I don't want to speak for state and federal entities, but there are a number of studies going on. Actually, I would say most of the major agencies, especially you just heard about Caltrans and others, are looking at this issue and have started looking at it. So I'm seeing more and more action as far as studying it and looking at options, not less.
Okay, that's the last question I see. Does anyone else have questions while we're all still here? Okay, well, thank you all for attending. Again, this is a great turnout. We're excited about the interest and look forward to your participation moving forward. And I think this format was really good for this. And thank you to all the participants. And we will conclude the meeting.
Timmy, did you want to just put up the slide with our contact information and our web address so people can write it down? I think it's, yeah.
Yes.
So yes, please send us comments by September 30th, whatever they might be. The comments and questions we've had to date really have got us thinking about different stuff, and we really encourage you to comment on the plan. In particular, if you are overwhelmed by the plan, then I recommend focusing on the executive summary. And there's a table at the end of the executive summary that lists near-term actions, potential near-term actions and priorities. And so if you're looking to focus your comments, then I recommend taking a look at those. So again, thank you for coming.
Thank you.